This is Duke University.
So this is called Discourse is Freedom, Discourse is Power, the Foucault-Habermas debate and the battle for the soul of critical theory. So that's a lot of discourse being thrown at you. Hopefully I'll get to all of it. But I'm actually going to start with coffee, inspired by Cyrus' presentation. So is coffee talk freedom or power? I'm a political theorist, and that means that unlike sane people like Syra, who think about concrete problems and concrete people, where they see individuals, I see giant systems. And so the giant system at work here is, of course, global capitalism. And right, so there's a lot of problems with global capitalism that everybody knows. There's we are alienated from the people who grow our coffee, but maybe more importantly, they're alienated from us and from the fruits of their labor. There's a lot of separation. This allows exploitation of workers and producers. There's obviously a lot of inequality between the countries, and particularly between the producers and the consumers. And as we were saying before, there's extreme insecurity within the coffee growing production, right? And all of this is so that we can have stuff like this, and we know that always ends badly. So back to capitalism. The question is, what do we do about this? And one of the solutions, it seems, is to say more coffee talk, right? More dialogue between producers and consumers. And that's kind of the whole point of this free trade idea, right? But you vote with your dollars in the end by buying free trade coffee. But in order to get to the place where you're doing that, you have to be convinced. You have to be convinced by somebody to do that. And you have to be convinced by this discourse of free trade that it's actually a good thing. Yeah.
Do you mean free trade or fair trade?
I mean fair trade. I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you for clarifying. I meant it's the ear. It's something. Right. So that's the question of fair trade: is will this discourse liberate us? Well, not us, but more the coffee growers. Or is it another tool of power, right? So you might think that this is another form of oppression. And let me try to explain why you might think that, right? We feel really good when we buy fair trade coffee, because we think, oh yes, well we are participating in the system, but we're doing it, we're giving that extra 4 cents to those producers, right? But as we've seen, it's still, there are benefits, there are problems with this, and the underlying inequality, the underlying nature of the work, and the underlying instability and insecurity is still there. And so in a certain sense, the discourse of fair trade can actually hurt because it sort of conceals the problem, and it makes us feel good about something that we shouldn't actually necessarily feel good about. So here's where political theory comes in. And it turns out that, you may not know this, but it turns out that whether you think discourse is a problem or a solution may depend on what you think of the Enlightenment. All right? So bear with me. So Enlightenment liberalism is, it's the source of capitalism in a lot of ways, but it's also the source of our democracy and our democratic traditions. And so if you're a fan of the Enlightenment, if you're a fan of things like rights and free markets and the rule of law, free speech, all of this stuff, you see the problems of capitalism, and you say, okay, there's a solution. The solution is within this tradition. It's within the Enlightenment tradition, within the liberal tradition. The Enlightenment represents the rule of reason, and reason can solve the problems that reason has created. But if you're Marx, for example, these things represent ideology right? This reason, this Enlightenment reason is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. So think about it. What are the most important rights? Rights to property. Property is what entrenches inequality. What about discourse, right? What about free speech? It's great if everybody can speak, but who's going to speak, right? People actually speaking are going to be people with privilege, people like me, white men, right? So the reason of the Enlightenment, according to Marx, is not is their reason. It's the reason of the bourgeois, of rich people. It's not the reason of everyone else, the working classes. So finally, we're at the battle for the soul. Can anything, and so this is the question that animates critical theory as a general project. It's obviously a lot more nuance within individual traditions, but basically, the question is, can we rescue anything from the Enlightenment? Can reason save itself? So along comes our first character, all right? And so it's quite a bit after Marx, right? So, okay. He comes from a long line of pessimists, the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And not only are they pessimists, they also add to the list of systems, of grand systems that are oppressing us, right? So not just capital, but also state bureaucracies and technology, right? Reason, it seems, Enlightenment reason is really good at solving technical problems. It's really good at answering how to get stuff done, but not necessarily good at answering why we should be doing it. And so all these systems, capitalism, bureaucracy, technology, they have a kind of inner logic, but it's an unthinking inner logic. And so most of those people that he comes from, this long line of theorists, say, can we rescue the Enlightenment? The answer is no. But Habermas actually thinks yes. And so that's what makes him unique in that tradition. And he does this by saying that he agrees with Marx and the critical theorists that there's a problem, but he thinks that there are resources within reason that can help save it. So communication or discourse. And this sort of reason, this communicative reason, it thinks of necessity about the goals and the ends that we have. And so the difference between these two kinds of rationality is that when you talk among other people, when you put yourself in a communicative situation, you simply can't rely on your own private goals. Your language has to be sort of universalizable. You can't just say, I want to support this policy because it's going to make me and my friends rich, right? You would be laughed off the stage in a communication, right? When you're communicating with other people, you can't use this private reason. You have to use this sort of common public reason. And so we're forced to think about common ends. And so if we allow these sorts of systems to guide our daily life, if we allow this sort of bureaucracy, technology, capitalism, if that's how we make our decisions on a day-to-day basis, then we are doomed, and the pessimists are right. But if we can replace our day-to-day interactions and the decisions that we make with this communicative discourse, with this communicative reason, and we can we can have that direct our lives, then perhaps we can be saved. But Foucault is not impressed. So here's the other half of this battle. For Foucault, no discourse is free from power, and the outcome of deliberation, the outcome of discourse, depends on who we are before we go into the deliberation, right? Nobody's a self-made man. We always carry the baggage with us that we bring to the debate, and that stuff. So the preferences that we have, the habits that we have, that's all already shaped by power relations and by these systems that critical theorists talk about. And he also develops even more systems that are pathological, right? So it's sort of a case of garbage in, garbage out in terms of the deliberation, right? If there's nothing purifying about this, about the process of deliberation or discourse. If what you put in is garbage, is influenced by power relations, and what you put out is also going to be influenced by power relations. There's no reason to trust that discourse or to expect us to expect it to liberate us. And in fact, it can actually just serve to reinforce the power relations that we are already embedded in, because it makes us think that we've escaped them. So, just as a final example, the Lincoln-Douglas debates are widely regarded as a model of like rational discourse, right? If you ever hear somebody complaining about, oh, you know, discourse these days in politics is so it's so degraded, like we never talk about anything important, like what about the good old days when Lincoln and Douglas, these national politicians, you know, had a rational debate on a national stage. You know, high school students all over the place learn that Lincoln-Douglas debate is the way to go. But what were they debating, actually? They were debating whether slavery should stay in the South or be able to expand to the rest of the nation, basically, right? So if you think about it, the terms of the debate are biased from the beginning against any sort of real liberation, and that required a civil war and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. So then the question is, so what does that mean? Is violence the only solution? And Foucault didn't have a whole lot of answers to this sort of question, and people saw him often just another pessimist. You know, Marx at least had an answer: violent revolution of the masses, right? But Foucault lived during the time of the Soviet Union and the Cultural Revolution in China, and so he couldn't accept that answer. He didn't accept that answer. And so I will end with this question, basically: what do we think? Can we save the Enlightenment? I will tell you when I'm finished writing my dissertation what I think. Some of my work, I was just going to mention briefly that some of my work investigates what these kinds of things that were talked about in the first two presentations, what they have to do with this question. Given that cognition is embodied, that language is necessarily emotional, there's no sort of pure reason. Like, what does that have to do with this question? But I'm not finished yet, so you'll have to get back to me. And until then, you can make up your own minds.